Intersectionality is more than a way to describe identity. It also acts as a rich analytical tool to understand complexity in the world, in people, and in experiences. Mujeres in Action is a nonprofit in Spokane that surfaced because Hansel Sanchez, MIA's founder, decided to start a bilingual advocacy center for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence in the Latinx community to prevent Spanish-speaking survivors from falling through the cracks. The present analysis will focus on the intersections of gender, race, class, and nation. Mujeres in Action's clients experience domestic violence and sexual assault at the intersection of these identities, oftentimes as poor and undocumented Latino women. Many survivors feel as though they have no power to leave their abusers due to fears of deportation or a lack of financial security. As an organization, then, MIA uses intersectional inquiry and practice to prevent Latinx survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault from falling through the cracks of systems that were not created for them, thus enacting a counter-hegemonic approach to client advocacy by centering non-dominant identities and experiences. Mujeres in Action was founded as a result of an intersectional analysis of a problem. Hill, Collins, and Bilge emphasize the importance of having synergy between critical inquiry and critical practice, as this synergy opens the door to new ways of knowing and/or practices. This type of analysis, therefore, can be used to illuminate institutional power, diagnose social problems, and to enhance activism. According to the Mujeres in Action website, founder Hansel Sanchez realized there was a gap in culturally responsive services for Spanish-speaking survivors of domestic and/or sexual violence. As a result, Mujeres in Action has used critical inquiry and practice to bridge the gap in services that Sanchez noticed, effectively linking theory with practice to empower communities and individuals. The structural domain of power refers to the power relations present in Mujeres in Action's organizational makeup. The mission statement of Mujeres in Action, as stated on their website, is to help and advocate for survivors of domestic violence and/or sexual assault, increase access to culturally relevant services for survivors, and educate the community about sexual and domestic violence from a Latinx perspective. On that account, an intersectional analysis of Mujeres in Action's organizational structure will illuminate how the organization wields institutional power to provide identity-centered advocacy. As a bilingual organization dedicated to providing services to their clients in their native languages, Mujeres in Action is creating accessible spaces for survivors to gain their power back. Mujeres in Action's 3 staff members are all Latino women occupying a variety of identities: immigrant, mother, woman, DACA recipient, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, and many more. The identities held by Mujeres in Action's employees are representative of the body of clientele they serve. A parallel Moraga would label an example of theory in the flesh. While undocumented survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, whose first language is not English, are often invisible, Mujeres in Action writes those experiences into existence, declaring that the experiences of poor, undocumented Latinx survivors matter. Moreover, Mujeres in Action's choice of language reflects their dedication to being a culturally responsive agency. First, their use of the word survivor instead of victim is working to actively return power to those who have experienced abuse. Normative narratives about domestic violence tend to portray women as victims lacking the agency to remove themselves from the situation. From an intersectional lens, Mujeres in Action's clients are experiencing abuse at the intersection of numerous identities associated with a lack of social power. By addressing their clients as survivors, Mujeres in Action is asserting their clients' worth outside of their abusers. Whereas the word victim maintains a rhetoric of powerlessness, survivor is a word that empowers. Furthermore, Mujeres in Action prioritizes usage of gender-neutral Spanish words. For example, referring to survivors as los sobrevivientes using the at symbol instead of the traditional o. This strategic employment of language works to debunk narratives about who experiences abuse in relationships. Abuse is not segregated to women alone. Therefore, it is important for Mujeres in Action to use articles and pronouns that reflect the expansiveness of familiar violence. Additionally, the use of gender-neutral pronouns and articles works to dismantle the heteronormativity present in the Spanish language. Inclusive language does two things for Mujeres in Action. It prevents the erasure of folks experiencing abuse in non-hegemonic ways and embraces complexity in a way that is humanizing for clients. In Meyer's article, Black Panther, Queer Racial and Intersectional Representation in Popular Culture, she argues that the failure to articulate intersectional representations of Blackness in Black Panther ultimately functions to reify both heteronormative and patriarchal cultural logics, thereby remaining allegiant to whiteness. Essentially, by erasing queer Black experiences, Black Panther continues to reinforce sexist and heterosexist oppression. The Spanish language is gendered, meaning that almost everything is masculine or feminine, not creating space for identity to exist outside of that binary. Yvonne Garcia, a 26-year-old non-binary person who grew up at the U.S.-Mexico border, describes it like this to NBC News. To me, Spanish and Mexican, Chicano, Mexican-American culture has always consisted of being a matter of one or the other, otherwise not acknowledged. There is so much unsaid but still judged simply because it doesn't fit. Garcia opts for the A sound at the end of traditionally gendered words, which they say allows more space to test what language helps them feel most like themselves. While Mujeres in Action's use of the at symbol is not as inclusive as the use of A or X at the end of gendered Spanish words, it is still actively working in debunking hegemonic narratives about who is impacted by domestic violence or sexual assault. In this sense, they are resisting gender-based power structures present within the Spanish language, creating space to embrace complexity through recognizing that oversimplifying identity is not a sufficient approach to advocacy. At the structural level, Mujeres in Action is employing theory in the flesh to provide culturally responsive advocacy to their clients. Mujeres in Action also operates in tandem with the disciplinary domain of power. This domain of power refers to how rules and regulations are fairly or unfairly applied based on race, sexuality, class, gender, ability, nation, and similar categories. One such disciplinary tactic occurs within narratives about what it means to be undocumented in the United States. As survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, immigration status adds an additional obstacle in seeking help, namely, lack of awareness about what rights an undocumented person experiencing abuse has. This lack of knowledge is further compounded by class. Immigration lawyers are often costly, and language barriers. Mujeres in Action works to combat this directly through providing an immigrants' rights page on their website in English and Spanish, where they list the rights of immigrants and undocumented persons experiencing abuse. In Invisibility as an Unnatural Disaster, author Mitsuya Yamada writes that those who feel powerless over their own lives know what it is like not to make a difference on anyone or anything. Our psychological mindset has already told us time and time again that we were born into a ready-made world into which we must fit ourselves, and that many of us do it very well. By having services and a webpage dedicated to undocumented survivors, Mujeres in Action is counteracting the invisibility many undocumented survivors face in their day-to-day lives as cultural discourses claim that undocumented persons have no state-sanctioned rights. Mujeres in Action does, however, encourage clients to consult with immigration attorneys for information relevant to their particular cases. Within the interpersonal domain of power, Mujeres in Action shows recognition of the complex way in which multiple domains of power intersect to create unique experiences for abuse survivors. Mujeres in Action's response to COVID-19 highlights how they operate within the interpersonal domain, showcasing their dedication to providing identity-centered advocacy. Their homepage states, "Maintaining social distance and staying safe at home may help us combat the spread of COVID-19, but on the other hand, it can result in greater risks for victims of domestic violence, including sexual assault. Furthermore, we understand that loss of income, among other factors, in many families can increase the level of stress at home, thus resulting in a higher probability of violence incidents. If you feel that things with your partner are getting worse because of this national health crisis, there is help for you. We want to share 3 recommendations." The 3 recommendations they share are to create a safety plan, practice self-care, and to seek help. They also provide additional resources for more information about COVID-19 in Spanish. As an agency, Mujeres in Action's COVID response demonstrates their knowledge of their clients' intersectional identities, recognizing that class and the pandemic can greatly affect one's experiences of violence. As a result, they include the practice of self-care in their recommendations for those experiencing abuse during this time by offering a calendar with practical self-care tasks. Adrienne Marie Brown's Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, understands self-care as a radical way of disrupting and rejecting systems of oppression. She writes that we are in a time of fertile ground for learning how we align our pleasures with our values, decolonizing our bodies and longings, and getting into the practice of saying an orgasmic yes together, deriving our collective power from our felt sense of pleasure. Through the pursuit of pleasure, i.e. self-care, one is actively resisting their oppressor's actions as well as using self-care as a survival tactic. Mujeres in Action's self-care calendar promotes a sort of pleasure activism, understanding that self-care is crucial to survival in the midst of a pandemic that has created conditions where instances of violence are increasing. Countering the interpersonal domain of power through pleasure activism points to Moraga's argument about feminism allowing heart to matter. Mujeres in Action's website states, "We believe that all people can embrace their identity, define their future, and change the world." Their work acknowledges oppression beyond the theoretical and material realms and into the personal realms, heart, that desire survivors to flourish. Mujeres in Action enacts a counter-hegemonic approach to client advocacy through centering non-dominant identities and experiences. They are dedicated to upholding a complex and nuanced understanding of human life and behavior throughout their organization. Through this analysis as Mujeres in Action, as well as volunteering with them since June, I am reminded of Moraga's question, what ideas never surface because we imagine we already have all of the answers? As a white woman, I am offered the privilege of public services being structured around my own identity. It is essential for me to constantly interrogate the ways in which I move through the world and allow space for new ideas to not only surface, but to be heard. Additionally, I have a responsibility to use intersectional analysis to think through other organizations that I am a part of and to work so people are not falling through the cracks. Mujeres in Action is an excellent example of the synergy between using intersectionality for critical inquiry and practice Hill Collins and Bilge write about that is so crucial to prevent people from falling through the cracks. They showcase not only the functionality of intersectionality, but its life-changing and saving potential when put to use.